Jerry?
Yeah, what can I do for you, Ron? You just tell me, what can I do for you?
It's a very personal, very important thing. Hell, it's a family motto. Are you ready, Jerry?
I'm ready.
Just want to make sure you're ready, brother. Here it is. Show me the money.
Hello and welcome to another episode of ERG PowerTalk. I'm your host, Joe Santana. That was a clip from the 1996 movie Jerry Maguire, where the football player Rod Tidwell, played by Cuba Gooding Jr., tells his sports agent Jerry Maguire, played by Tom Cruise, exactly how to keep him as a client. Show me the money. Now, ERG leaders are not exactly screaming, show me the money, at their organization's business leaders, but some organizations have made headlines by deciding to pay their ERG leaders for their extra work on behalf of the company. And this has generated several questions, including the following. How many companies are doing this and why now? What are the pros and cons for this practice? How are various companies addressing this? That and more are the topics for our discussion with our guest today. Jes Osrow is the head of learning and development at Quartet Health. Her goal is to empower organizational culture to be inclusive, diverse, equitable, and accessible for all employees. As a co-founder of the RISE Journey, she works to operationalize diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and accessibility strategies as part of building foundational and sustainable organizational culture. Her focus is squarely on hands-on engagement, real-world experiences, and communicating successes and struggles in the personal and professional realms. It's great to have you here, Jes. Thank you for joining us. So, Jes, let's just jump right into this by talking a little bit about how you decided to get involved with ERGs.
Yeah, so way back in my career, 10 years ago, I started as an executive assistant to a CFO for a sports tech company. I very quickly, within 2 months, became in charge of HR, was running everything, somehow got everybody's social security numbers, was running payroll, hiring everybody. And very quickly, all of the inequities within the workplace became very clear. There was a lot of nepotism. The company was run by a bunch of old white dudes. And my caveat is to say, I love white men. I am dating a white man, but there was a lot of old white dudes in this organization. And it was just all of the inequities became apparent. I started an internship program. I started targeting, making sure that we were hiring from diverse locations, making sure we were looking at historically Black colleges, universities, not just posting our jobs in the same places, and doing DEI work without understanding that that was what I was doing. And as I progressed in my career, recognizing the power of people in groups. And specifically, when it comes to ERGs, I didn't really know about them until probably about 5 or 6 years ago when I was at an organization. And then bad shit happened. And you're like, oh, who do I go to? What do I do? And all of a sudden, these groups come together and you have these conversations and you're able to process and you're able to feel. And it changes the game. It changes how you feel about working. It changes how you feel about an organization. It changes what you're willing to do for that organization, to stay there, to work and keep with these people. Because ultimately, it's about the people you're working with. It's not usually about the job you're doing, or less so about the job you're doing. And so I've been running HR for a number of different organizations or somewhere in the HR space. And ERGs are my number one jam. I nerd out real hard about them. I think they are the lifeblood of organizations. And when done right, they can have a dramatic impact on retention, on engagement, on recruitment. They really can make or break an organization, especially when it comes to a digital presence and especially when it comes to word of mouth and reputation.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I recall correctly, in our last conversation, about a year ago, you launched your first survey on the topic of ERG value and also included in that some questions about compensation. Tell us what you learned.
Yeah, so I actually just closed out the second survey and started processing the data. So I have a little sneak peek for the report, which will be coming out, if I keep to my timelines, will be coming out in about 3 weeks. What I found is that in 2020, 6% of organizations who filled out the survey paid their leads. They compensated them in some way. At that time, the majority were compensating in cold hard cash, which is always our recommendation. But there were a number in terms of additional professional development opportunities, mentorship, so on and so forth. So looking at compensation in a more flexible way, not just cash. This year, which was really exciting, in 2021, that number went up from 6% to 28%. So a pretty astronomical leap in the span of a year. We attribute a lot of this, and by we, I mean the Rise Journey team, to the social justice reckoning and movements that are happening around the world, not just in the US, but very heavily in the US. This is not to say that social justice movements haven't been happening since forever, specifically when it comes to race, but they are coming to light and they're invading our workplaces. And as they creep more and more into the workplace, ERGs have become such a vital part of that. So relating back to compensation is really exciting to see that there is value being put from the organizations into ERGs who are dealing with everything that's going on in the world in our country.
Yeah. Say more about that in terms of the social justice movements and other things that are, from what you're telling us, driving some of the ways that more organizations are compensating and so forth, the ERG leaders. Why is it so different now in terms of the impact that it's having versus the impact that it had years ago?
Yeah, so first to the audience listening, I am a white, heterosexual, cisgendered woman in my 30s. I am a millennial through and through. And I think right there, starting with something like that, starting with my pronouns are she, her, this is all part of the racial reckoning. It's part of the gender reckoning. It's part of the sexuality reckoning, whatever you want to, all of the, intersectional pieces of our identities are coming together. And more and more, we're realizing that just doesn't end when we go to the office or the virtual office. This is who we are. We bring this every day. Joe, you and I were talking about all of our Zoom lives now and how there's children and there's dogs and there's interruptions and there's things. This is part of our life. And part of, honestly, the pandemic has pushed forward a lot of the work that ERGs are doing as well, because something has to keep organizations together. And who better than the actual people? Before, it was an HR leader saying, hey, you have to abide by these things, you have to do these things. Oftentimes it was a white person. Oftentimes it was somebody who says, oh yeah, sure, I'm an ally, I'm not racist. But what are you doing to not be racist? I'm actively anti-racist. What are you doing to be pro-gender fluidity in the workplace? What are you doing to make sure that there is accessibility in the workplace? And all of a sudden, again, a lot because of the social justice reckonings, among other things, we're saying, this is me. I'm bringing this. If I am Black and George Floyd is murdered, you don't just keep that out of the workplace. That is in you. That is part of you. That affects everything. And employers are starting to recognize that you're treating the whole employee. This is a holistic approach. You can no longer just say, hey, Joe, do your 9 to 5 and go home. And if you're crying, if you're traumatized, if you have something going on, I, as an employer, have to recognize that. And ERGs are vital and a huge component of supporting employers to recognize that, but also employees supporting each other, which is ultimately where that connection comes from.
It's interesting. It seems like the expectations of the workforce and the workplace have changed somewhat from what they were years ago. And that's what's driving it. The things that are happening may be similar in nature to what was happening before, but how people in the workplace and in the workforce who make up this body of the workforce are looking at it, and their expectations when they look at leaders and what they expect from leaders and the organization, that has evolved and shifted. So that explains why this sudden focus on these groups in terms of their value that they drive in these particular areas. So when you were talking before about compensating ERG leaders, you mentioned about how there are some organizations that are doing it with cash, but there are organizations that are also doing it in some other ways. One other question I have is, were those organizations that compensate in non-cash ways included in your 28% and 20%? They were.
Yes,
they were included. Yes. For those who are not watching and are only listening, Jes nodded.
Yes.
And that's why I took it as yes. Okay. So they are. So what are some of those other ways that they are compensating? What are some of the most common ways that ERGs leaders and BRG leaders who are not compensated monetarily are compensated?
Yeah. And just kind of a caveat in there, we made compensation really broad. Compensation can mean a lot of different things. It could be a bonus. It could be, and we'll discuss some of these other elements. It can be really broad. And oftentimes, because organizations are different sizes, they have different amounts of money coming in, nonprofits, for-profits. compensation means different things to different people. It's a reward more so than necessarily compensation. So that's why it is broad. So looking at some of those pieces in terms of things that they're using, again, cash, whether that's an annual stipend or quarterly payout, could be in the form of a bonus or a spot bonus. And I usually say a spot bonus is like an unexpected bonus, like, hey, here's an extra $200, go for it. Talking about professional development, this could be in the form of additional coaching, mentorship, internal mentorship from the C-suite, somebody really high up. You get exposure to somebody you might not ordinarily get to see. Sometimes this is company swag, this is gift cards. It can really vary pretty dramatically in terms of what compensation is considered. I will say, and I have the stat over here, that in 2024, even though 6% of organizations were paying, 24% were considering compensating in some form. And this most recent survey went up to 48%, so doubled. So now 28% in 2021 are compensating, and 48% are considering some form of compensation. Again, what that compensation is varies. One of the things they're considering, 16% are considering doing an annual stipend of some sort. Again, cash is king. And 16% are considering a professional development opportunities of some form. One thing we plan on asking for at about next year is, what is the monetary worth of that professional development opportunity? What is the monetary worth of the swag? Because ultimately, there is a dollar amount at the end of the day of how much the organization is spending on it. So figuring out if you're spending $2,000 on coaching, should that person get the $2,000 instead? And so figuring that out and talking more about that is the 2022 survey. So for all those out there listening, please fill it out when it comes out. And then on the dollar amount, there was some pretty dramatic variances in that dollar amount. And there was actually no trends between size of the organization and how much they paid. I, generally speaking, assume that if you're a 10,000 person company, you got more cash, you can pay more, but there was no trends. Some smaller companies were paying a lot more, some larger companies were paying a lot less, but 21% of those who said they were considering compensation indicated that they would pay between $1 and $1,000 annually, and 4% indicated $5,000 to $10,000, which tended to be on the higher end. 10,000 is very much on the higher end, such as a LinkedIn or an Autodesk and Uber and what they're paying.
Got it. There are people that are against any form of compensation, even training and development as a compensation, because they consider the ERGs and the BRGs to be extracurricular activity. So they'll say, well, if we're going to do that, then we're going to have to give extra compensation to the people who are running the softball team or some other thing like that. And so they try to make that equivalence between ERGs and these other groups. But that's not the case, is it? There is a vast difference of what ERGs bring to the table that justify having some form of compensation, even if it's in the form of extra training or extra opportunities to connect with others. Can you talk a little bit about that, Jes?
Yeah, so that had come up a lot in the survey, and also actually one of our advisors at Rise wrote the dissenting voice, which is in the report, because it is important to recognize that is a real concern. People are worried, are we going to incentivize people to do the wrong thing because we're adding compensation to it? I think the ultimate thing is, one, this is extra work. A softball team is extracurricular. Oftentimes these ERGs are putting together educational programs. They are bringing in speakers. They are doing the job of a DEI or HR role. And most often, if you look around at the leads of your ERGs, they are historically marginalized folks. They are from underrepresented groups. They historically and systemically are underpaid. If you look at the statistics about women being underpaid, what is it? I think 78 cents to the male, white male dollar. When you go down and say Black women, when you go down and say Latino women, when you say trans women, the numbers just go down dramatically. These are the folks who historically, and again, look at your current organizations, are leading the ERGs. So not only are they doing extra work that helps the organization, it helps build their bottom line, it brings diversity, it helps recruitment, it helps retention, it helps engagement. So they're doing this work for the organization, and they're being underpaid in their full-time jobs because most organizations aren't doing pay equity reports. They aren't checking out that compensation. Work is work is work. This is work they're doing. They are putting in hours above their 9 to 5, or I don't know anybody who works 9 to 5. Everybody I know does way more than the standard 40-hour work week. And then they do their ERG work on top of it. And then they go home and parent. And then they take care of their grandmother. And then they take care of their pet. And then they're like, oh, I have to exercise so I can take care of my own mental health. This is additional work. And until an organization can recognize it, they don't deserve it. Period. End of story. And again, going back to the additional professional development, I think that's great. I think that needs to be on top of a yes and to actual compensation. Because if these are folks, again, who are historically marginalized, historically underrepresented, historically underpaid for their jobs, cash is king. And I'm going to say that about 1,000 times, and I apologize now, or cash is queen, or whatever. Because money goes a lot farther. You don't know what I need to spend money on. You don't know if I have loans. You don't know if I have fertility things. You don't know if I'm paying for care for somebody else. Cash is what rules the world and what actually supports me. I can find my own professional development. I have my own mentors. I have my own whatevers. And so it's really important for organizations to think long and hard again about who they are, who's doing the work. One, what is their background? What are their demographics? What level in the organization? Oftentimes, ERG leaders tend to be lower in the organization because they're passionate, because they're excited. Maybe it's younger folks even who are just like, yes, I'm out of college, I'm out of high school, I'm ready to do something. And then they say, oh my gosh, these are my people. And anybody who's been in a great ERG, those are their people. And they would do most anything for them. That's why they stay at an organization, even if it's toxic. That's why they stay if they're underpaid, is because they have people who get them and understand them and support them.
Yeah, great point. So clearly, these groups can drive a tremendous amount of value to the organization. So what do you think keeps some leaders from seeing that value?
They're too far removed. And I think that's a really benign reason of just like, oh, well, your C-suite is up at the top. They don't see what's going on in the everyday. And this is part of the shift in leadership that is sometimes starting to happen and needs to happen more, is a shift towards servant leadership. This is about your employees. This is about saying, how can we have impact on our employees? Because otherwise they're going to leave. Google the Great Resignation. You're going to come up with 1,000 articles. The world is changing. Social justice is changing. Organizations need to change with them. And part of that is for leadership to say, if I'm not seeing what's happening in the rest of my organization, I need to change what I am doing to see that or see the lack of it. Leaders need to take a concerted effort and say, okay, when's the last time I joined an ERG conversation? When's the last time I joined an event hosted by an ERG? Is our HR or DEI team measuring what's going on? Do we know what success metrics look like? I don't know a single CEO that doesn't know the success metrics of their organization or C-suite. So if you know that, there's no reason you don't know the success metrics of your ERG. And I talk a lot about in the report, like, how do you measure that success? What does success even look like, organization to organization? And it is the responsibility of C-suite, VP, whomever leadership is, to know that this is your organization. Get with the program. And when you don't get with the program, that's when it doesn't become benign anymore. That's when it becomes really malignant, and it's going to cause a problem that you're purposely putting your blinders on versus actively trying to learn more and grow. And ultimately, like, enough is enough, because there's a billion reports out there that say diversity is good for business. And we live in a for-profit world. We live in a capitalistic world where even nonprofits need to make money here. So if diversity is good for your bottom line, it's time for you to start paying attention. No excuses.
Mm-hmm. Great point. So Jes, give me an example of how an ERG that drives value can package that value in a way and then communicate it up to a skeptical leadership. Let's say that skepticism comes from that disconnect of being too far away from what's going on the ground. What would be a way that an ERG or a BRG could do that?
I think one of the hardest parts about this, and ERGs and BRGs in general, and when I say ERGs, I mean affinity groups, I mean BRGs, there's like a number of different nomenclatures for them. One, the biggest thing you need is structure. So what are the leads? What are the purposes? What are the responsibilities? What are things categorized? What are some different pillars? I usually use these 4 pillars of tech, product, and consumer. How does your ERG contribute to tech, product, and consumer? How does it contribute to brand and recruitment? How does it contribute to internal culture? And how does it contribute to learning and development? So as you start to categorize these initiatives, you can start to track them more. You can start to put structure to them. If you say, we have 5 ERGs, we want each ERG to do one event or something in each pillar, and we want to make sure that we have attendance. And so one thing is tracked by attendance. Another thing is going to be tracked by number of new customers. Another thing is going to be tracked by XYZ. So as you put these initiatives together, it's important to say, how do we define success? I don't care if it's a micro event or a large scale thing. There's always a success metric, and that could be binary. It happened. It didn't happen. It could be a percentage. It could be a dollar amount. There's always a way to put a number behind it. Something that leadership can do that is really helpful for ERGs is help them figure out how to make something quantitative. This is a really hard skill that a lot of people don't know how to do. And it's a great way. If they don't know how to make something quantitative, send them off to a course, help them have somebody who's good with numbers and analytics help them. because putting numbers to that says, okay, this was a success or this wasn't. Why not? What does that postmortem look like? Just like any other strategic initiative you're going to do in any other part of your organization, you should always have metrics associated with it. The other piece is adding performance reviews for ERG leads. Every person who participates as an ERG lead or in some capacity that's a little bit more formal than just an ally or an identifier, you need to recognize that. You need to say, okay, I know, Joe, that you did this for 6 months. What did you learn? How did you grow? Making sure you're getting the opinions of the people who see it every day and making sure you're recognizing that behavior. Again, these are historically underrepresented and marginalized folks. So if you can get them and somebody says, oh my gosh, Jane Doe, she just showed so much leadership capabilities and she was really able to delegate and she got all of this stuff done, and that's recognized in a performance review, that person is more likely to get a raise and a promotion and get into leadership roles that are historically very white and very male dominated. So this is not only about compensating ERG leads for their worth now, but how can you get them to rise through their ranks, which every organization seems to have that problem with, and get representation throughout. It's about tracking, putting success metrics, and it's about recognizing, making sure that their performance is evaluated. And those are the 2 tips I would say. If you leave here today, get a performance review template. It could be 3 or 4 questions, really basic for your ERG leads, and make sure that every single thing they do has a success metric associated with it.
So given everything that's been happening for the last 20 months now since the pandemic, and then later on we had social unrest and all the different layers of things that have happened, what are some of the things that you see ERG and BRG leaders doing now or groups doing now that address some of those challenges that have shown up as a result of pandemic and all these other things? Because clearly they were doing a lot of great stuff before, some of which is covered in some of the things that we've just talked about. But there's been added challenges, and without added challenges come added opportunities. What are some of the things that you've seen that these groups have done to address the disruption after the global pandemic and social unrest?
Yeah, the organizations that are doing it right are saying, we don't have enough information. Let's bring the ERG leaders into this conversation. Let's have them step up and be able to have their voice heard. And so they're stepping into different forums. They're raising their hands more often. So they're having somebody advocate for them and say, actually, like, we should have these people in the room. And so there's more voice, again, I've said 1,000 times, of these underrepresented and historically marginalized folks in these positions where they never had them before. And frankly, if it hadn't been for the pandemic, they may not have gotten these opportunities. When our entire working world has been thrown into a cyclone and we're still kind of figuring it out, more voices can get gotten to the mix. I've seen a lot of ERGs who are supporting policies and procedures. What does a return to work policy look like? If you have a disability ERG, you better believe that disability ERG is getting involved in saying, hey, we have immunocompromised folks who might have to come in. Are you doing a vaccine mandate or not? If you are, how are you proving it? How are you going to make sure that your folks are safe? Are we thinking about things differently? How does this affect people who may have moved during the company? And now you're saying, oh, everybody has to go back to the office. Well, I know for me, I was in Brooklyn for the past 10 years, and now I'm in New Hampshire. I have very different issues with potential going back to the office versus not. Thinking about how people work best. You mentioned accessibility. For me, accessibility isn't just about disability, but every person works differently. Every person has best practices. And so ERGs are really helping organizations figure out, Joe, how do you work best and how do I work best? And how can an organization empower that? How can an ERG empower that? I think one of the most common things that ERG leads have done is set up forum discussions, process groups, whatever you want to call them. So when big events happen in the real world, we say, we're going to stop and we recognize that people are hurting. We recognize that things are going on, that people are confused. We're going to take an hour, we're going to take 2, and we're just going to have a group. And if we all sit here in silence, at least we're all here together because we all know that something has happened and we just need to be together and unite, even if we are in this, digital Zoom world. Bringing in facilitators. Not everybody who's a lead of an ERG is equipped to lead a difficult discussion or talk about the social justice reckoning, et cetera, et cetera. And so bringing in folks who can say, hey, I can facilitate this discussion. And so that weight doesn't live on the shoulders of the lead. And so bringing in outside support has been a huge, huge thing that ERGs have done. And recognizing that they can't and shouldn't have to do it all. Part of the dissenting voice we have is ERGs shouldn't be paid because there should be somebody doing this role full time. They shouldn't have to do any of this. They should contribute, but it should be an extracurricular. But that means there's hiring 2 or 3 or 4 more folks, depending on the size of your organization, to do that work. And organizations aren't there yet for the most part, or aren't willing. They're still trying to hire their one DEI person, expect that DEI person to do everything. There's a new DEI jobs board that just got posted that is only for DEI jobs. And you look at it and you're like, there's thousands on here. When a year ago, there were hundreds. And then when 2 years ago, there was 2. And so organizations are trying to compensate and have heavily leaned on their ERGs to compensate. And so some have done it well, some have done it, they've all done it well, but they're burned out.
Yeah, I would imagine. So totally agree with everything you said. I personally think that the opportunities for ERGs to drive value just continue to increase. In fact, I recently interviewed a CEO for the program who talked about how these groups have become her organization's cultural lifeboats. And as we move away from the old model of where most employees were working in one place at the same time, I think that was like 94% of all employees reported to the same place at the same time. 6% were remote. Pandemic changed all that. We're now in a more distributed workforce where it went up to about 35% during the height of the pandemic. Now it's dropped to 25%, but still, that's quite a chunk of people that are working remotely. You have more people working on shifts, so they work in the same place, but not at the same time. You have more people that are working asynchronously, which means they're not in the same place or in the same time. The question becomes, well, how do you hold all these people together as part of one group and one organizational culture when some of them are permanently remote, some of them are in the same place but not at the same time, some of them are never in the same place at the same time, nor are they working within the same time period. How do you do that? And a lot of organizations have found, as the CEO did, that one of the glues that holds together all those different dimensions is the ERGs and the BRGs, these informal groups. What are your thoughts on that, Jes?
Cultural lifeboat is such a great visual. I can see that. And I can see in my personal experience as a consultant, I see those people, they're bringing them into these rafts. They're saying, we get it, you're struggling and we're here. And I think that is so key for that CEO to recognize. And I hope that everybody can start to see that faster and quicker, because these folks, again, are going to leave. They are the glue. They are the ones holding it together. And it's little things. It's remembering to say, hey, I know your sister was sick. How's she doing? And that's something that a CEO or an HR person may not know, but the person at the digital next door neighbor is going to know. And these moments that are shared between people are powerful. We're not robots. We're not automatons. Like, we need to have this connection. And in a digital world, it's harder. And so investing in those items, those groups, those people who can create culture, because not everybody's a culture carrier, and leads tend to rise up because of that. You want to invest in those groups. You want to invest in those people because they are that glue. They are that, like, somebody's steering the lifeboat. Somebody's pulling other people on the side. Somebody's trying to get the motor running. Somebody's putting up a tent. Like, it's not just one person either. It truly is about this group and this cohesion and wanting to do more and wanting to help people. Ultimately, I have a bunch of quotes in the report from leaders, and it's just so clear that, again, lifeboats, life vests, like, they are the saving equipment for these organizations, and they're changing the game. They're changing what a healthy organization looks like. They're changing what healthy remote work looks like. They make a difference. And if you don't believe me, look at some Glassdoor reviews about ERGs and people and culture, and organizations that are abandoning their culture and their ERGs and their culture carriers are going down in ratings. People don't want to join. They're not getting the same caliber of applicants. So it's a cultural glue, but the reach goes far, far beyond just that internal culture.
That's a great point too. So how do you recommend organizations assess getting to a fair place in terms of how they compensate their ERG, BRG leaders, whether that's monetary or in some other form? How are some of the ways that you've seen that organizations get their arms around that and set that point of how to compensate for these various outputs?
So start, again, that structure. What are the roles? What are the expectations? You're never going to be able to quantify how much culture contribution does this group have versus this group have. That's just not a reality. So knocking that out of the way now and just saying, okay, ERG leads are going to be paid, at least to start, equally. And maybe we set all the expectations the same. And then if they do things above and beyond, like there's an a la carte menu and you can pay something. But for right now, start with that baseline. Getting a budget line item that says compensation for ERG leads, period. Getting that in, whether it's $100 or $200, whatever it is, start by getting something in because you can always increase it. Generally speaking, I'm never going to recommend non-cash compensation. Organizations are going to do it
because cash is king.
Because cash is king. There we
I
go.
thought I'd say that
like you've heard that before. And it just goes farther. It means more. And I have a little chart in the report. And I just say like baseline. Again, I don't know a single ERG lead, whether they're doing crazy activities or they're just cultivating a group that spend less than 5 hours a week on this. So let's assume you have one lead. They spend 5 hours a week, 260 hours a year, because we're going to pay everybody for 52 weeks because I don't believe in not paying them for the full year. That means that they get an annual bonus if they're paid at $15 an hour, which is not even minimum wage, of $3,900. That's a pretty dinky little bonus. So at minimum, my recommendation is pay an ERG lead for 5 hours a week at $15 an hour, which is a $4,000 commitment. And if you pay them out quarterly, which we also do suggest paying out quarterly versus annually, that's just under $1,000 quarterly. Most C-suite I know have coaching sessions that cost more than $1,000. So when you're thinking about a quarterly payout for one lead as $1,000, that's pretty nominal. So let's increase that. Most organizations have more than one lead. If you have 8 leads, again, 40 hours a week at $15 an hour, that's an annual salary of $31,000, $31,200. Again, pretty nominal. That's pretty low. And when you parse that out, it's a quarterly payout of $7,800. Yes, we don't want to spend money. We don't want to have expenses. But paying out $31,000 a year for 8 folks is a pretty low level commitment and a pretty low level of saying, hey, Joe, we appreciate your work. Your contribution matters. And although I can't quantify it every single millisecond of it, we know that it's there. And we know there's certain expectations and we know that you're having a performance review on it. And therefore, we believe that that's enough to qualify you to get this money. So I recommend $15 an hour. And figure out your minimum. Not all companies can contribute 5 hours a week, but figure out what your minimum number of hours a week is and just pay them. And you should have some sort of structure of how long somebody's a lead, how often there is elections or however you're doing it, but pay out quarterly, because if somebody is there for 3 quarters and then they leave, you're not going to pay them for that 3 quarters. So if you're doing an annual bonus. So paying them out quarterly, figure out whatever cycle other folks in your organization are on for bonuses. Most sales folks are on bonus cycles. Work with finance so that you're not doing a whole new payment structure. Just get on the same cycle as someone else or another part of the organization. It's pretty minimal. And my guess is after 1 year of doing this, you're not even going to notice it. You're going to say, oh, should we increase it by 5%? Inflation went up? Sure. It just becomes another line item you discuss rather than like, oh, should we do this or should we not? Just get it in there. If that's still too much money, pay them $100 a month. Just get something in the system is the core piece right now.
So let me ask you this. If any of our listeners who have heard you talk about your report, if they want to get access to that report, how do they do that? And then the second question is, if they want to participate in a future survey where you are updating the report, how do they do that?
Yes, so go to our website, www.therisejourney.com, just how it sounds. Then just sign up for the newsletter. We send a newsletter every other month. We won't spam you. Your email won't get shared. It's a pretty chill newsletter in the space of newsletters. I get that not everybody wants to have another thing in their inbox. We will be sending out the results there. The new survey should launch probably around April. I'm going to try to give myself a couple months off after the holiday. And so we would love participation. We had 78 organizations participate in 2020 and 161 participate in 2021. And so I'm looking again to do more than double in this next round because the data is important, and more year-over-year data, we can see more trends and see more insight into what's actually happening in the real world and bring more transparency. And follow me on social media. LinkedIn is where I nerd out real hard. The rest of social media is boring on my behalf, but I LinkedIn real hard. And so if you follow me or add me on LinkedIn, I'll be sharing a lot of results there as well. And something I did want to offer to your listeners, anybody who listens to this podcast, a free half-hour time with me, and I'll talk to you about ERGs just for fun or whatever, just because this work takes community. So I wanted to offer that to your listeners as well.
Excellent. Thanks, Jess. And Jess, is there an email address that they can reach you?
Yes, Jes, Jes, Jes with one S, at therisejourney.com.
Okay, great. Just thank you again for being with us today.